The lantern had gone out somewhere on the last mile home, and I remember thinking that was the only mercy I got that night. It was November. The road was frozen hard. The buggy wheels made that sound they make on cold packed dirt, a sound I have not heard in years and still hear in my sleep. My husband held the reins in one hand. His other hand was resting on the bench between us, not touching me, just there, waiting. And I sat beside him in my good black dress, with my hands folded in my lap like I had been taught, and I stared straight ahead at the horse's ears in the dark, and I understood, somewhere in the middle of that ride, that we were not going to make it to the house. Before I go any further, I'm Martha. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where women who grew up plain finally say the things we were never allowed to say out loud. I was Old Order, Lancaster County. I left. And if you want to hear the truths that stay behind the prayer cap, subscribe, tap that like button, and tell me in the comments, what do you think a husband is allowed to ask of his wife when nobody is watching? Because that question has an answer in my community. A very specific answer. And it is not the one you would guess. Stay with me. Because what I am about to describe is not one bad night with one bad man. If it were, this would be a much easier story to tell, and a much easier one to hear. It is something worse than that, and quieter than that, and if you grew up anywhere near a world like mine, it is going to sound uncomfortably familiar. Let me explain something first. Because if I do not explain it, the rest of this will sound like a story about one man, and it is not. It is a story about a rule that was never written down anywhere, never preached from a bench, never printed in any book, and yet every married woman in my church district knew it by heart. In the plain world, the ordnung governs everything. What color your dress is, how wide the brim of his hat, whether your buggy has a windshield, whether your kitchen has a gas refrigerator or an icebox, how you part your hair, whether the wheels on your carriage may have rubber on them, and in some districts, whether you may accept a ride in a car and under what circumstances. It is unwritten, but it is absolute, and it is enforced by the entire community at once, all the time, without anyone ever having to say a word to you directly. What most people do not understand is that the ordnung does not stop at the barn door. It follows you into the house, it follows you up the stairs. And there is a second ordnung underneath the first one, the one nobody writes down and nobody reads aloud, the one that governs what happens between a husband and a wife in the dark. Here is what I was taught, in pieces, never all at once, never directly. First, a wife submits. Not sometimes, not when she feels able, not when it is convenient, always. The word we used was gelassenheit, yielding, surrender, the giving up of self. It is a beautiful word. It was preached to me from the time I could sit still on a bench as the highest virtue a woman could possess, and it meant, in practice, that my own wanting was not a factor in any decision made about my own body. Second, a husband leads. His judgment about when and where and how is presumed correct because he is the head of the household and God placed him there. There is no appeal. There is no second opinion. There is no bishop you go to about this. There is not even a vocabulary for objecting because objecting is hochmut. Pride. And pride was the worst sin we had. Worse than anger. Worse than envy. The root of everything. Third, marriage is a covenant, and a covenant is not a negotiation. Once you say the vows in front of the bishop, you have already answered every question your husband will ever ask you. In advance, forever. Every question, for the rest of your life, answered by one word spoken at 20 years old on a Thursday in October, in a room full of 300 people. And fourth, this is the one that took me the longest to understand. Silence is modesty. To speak about any of this, even to your own mother, even to your own sister, even to your own husband, was immodest. Talking about the body was already halfway to sinning with it. So the rules were absolute and the rules were unspeakable, both at the same time. Do you see what that does? Sit with it for a second. because it took me years to see it. It creates a system where a woman knows exactly what is expected of her and has no words at all to describe it. Not to complain, not to refuse, not even to ask. Now, let me tell you about the buggy ride. We had been married 3 months. It was a Sunday, and we had gone to a visiting supper at his brother's place, 7 miles out. Amish people do not just go home after church. We visit, we eat. We sit in kitchens until the lamps burn low, and the children fall asleep in the corners on folded quilts. That night there was chicken and noodles, and pickled beets, and a chouflée pie so wet on the bottom that it stuck to the plate, and I remember laughing at something one of the aunts said, and feeling for 1 hour like a young woman instead of a wife. I want you to hold on to that detail. I was happy that night. That is not a small thing to admit. We left around 10. It gets dark early in November, and it gets cold in a way you cannot understand unless you have sat in an open buggy at 30 degrees with nothing between you and the wind but wool and whatever the good Lord gave you. He tucked the lap robe over my knees before we started. That was a kind thing. I want to be honest about that, because I am going to tell you the rest of it, and I do not want you to think he was a monster. He was not. He tucked the robe over my knees, and he checked the buckle on the harness twice. And then we drove. The horse knew the road. She always did. The wheels clicked over the frozen ruts. There was no moon that I remember, or if there was, the clouds had it. And somewhere around the 3rd mile, his hand moved from the bench to my knee, on top of the wool, and stayed there. I did not move. I did not say anything. I looked at the horse's ears. His hand moved up, slowly, under the robe. And I said the only thing I had ever heard a woman say in my entire life in that situation, which was nothing at all. Now here is where I need you to understand something about how we court, because it explains why I froze, and if I skip this, you will think I was simply timid, and I was not. Before marriage, there is bundling in some communities, sitting up in others, and in every single one of them there is one enormous, unshakable, load-bearing line. Below the waist is forbidden. Absolutely. Without exception. That line is drilled into a girl from the time she is 14 years old. It is the entire architecture of her virtue. It is what she is. A boy may sit on your bed until 4 a.m. with your parents' blessing, and that line does not move an inch. And then you get married, and the line does not move. It disappears. Completely. Overnight. Nobody tells you that. Nobody sits you down the week before the wedding and says, everything you were taught was forbidden is now not only permitted but required of you, and you are expected to know the difference the instant the bishop finishes speaking, and there will be no further instruction. I went from one absolute rule to the exact opposite absolute rule, with no bridge in between. And in the buggy, on that frozen road, in the dark, my body was still obeying the first rule and my marriage was demanding the second one, and I sat there paralyzed between the two of them like a woman standing on a fence in a wind. He pulled the horse to a stop. Not at the house, on the road, between fields. There was a fence line and a stand of bare trees and nothing else for a mile in any direction. No lights, no neighbors, just the sound of the mare breathing and shifting in her traces. And he said, and I remember the exact words, because I have carried them for years and I expect I will carry them until I am buried. He said, "You are my wife." Not a question, not a request, not even an argument. A statement of fact, offered as a complete explanation, and in the world I came from it was a complete explanation. That sentence was the beginning and the end of the conversation. That sentence contained every permission he would ever need. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is this. I did not say no. And I want to be very careful here, because the thing I have spent years in therapy learning is that not saying no is not the same thing as saying yes. Those are not the same. They have never been the same. But I did not have that sentence. I did not have those words. Nobody had ever given them to me. Not once. Not in 20 years. I had a word for obedience. I had a word for submission. I had a word for pride. I had a word for shame. I did not have a word for I do not want this right now. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. There were a dozen words in my entire vocabulary for what a wife owes her husband, and not one single word for what she is permitted to keep. Afterward, he clicked to the horse, and we drove the last mile home, and neither of us said anything at all. I remember the lantern was out. I remember the cold coming back into my hands, into my fingers, the feeling of them going stiff around the edge of the robe. I remember going inside and hanging my bonnet on the peg by the door exactly the way I did every single night of my life, and thinking very clearly that is done now, and I do not know what happened. The next morning I made breakfast. Eggs, scrapple, coffee. He ate. He said the horse had a stone in her shoe and he would see to it. He went out to the barn. It was Monday, and there was washing to do, and the wringer was in the cellar and the water had to be heated. And by 9 o'clock I had my sleeves rolled and my hands in the water, and I was singing, quietly, the way you do. And here is the part that people from the outside always struggle with. And I understand why. I was not angry. Not that morning. Not that year. Not for years and years. Because in my head, nothing wrong had happened. He had done what a husband is permitted to do. I had done what a wife is required to do. The system had functioned exactly as it was designed to function. Every part of it worked. The only thing that appeared to be broken, as far as I could tell, was me, for feeling strange about it afterward. That is the trap. That is the entire trap, right there, and I want you to see it clearly. When the rule is total and the vocabulary is empty, the woman does not blame the rule. She has no way to see the rule. So she blames herself, and she goes down to the cellar, and she does the washing. I want to tell you about Rebecca now. Rebecca was my friend. She married 2 years before I did, a man from a neighboring district, and she was one of those women who was always laughing, always the loudest voice at a frolic, always the one with flour up to her forearms and an opinion about everything and everyone. If you had asked me to name the strongest woman in our church district, I would have said her name without pausing. We were canning peaches. This was maybe a year after my wedding. Hot kitchen, steam sitting on the windows, jars lined up on the counter in rows, the smell of syrup and hot metal. And she said, apropos of absolutely nothing at all, without looking up from the paring knife, "Do you ever just stand out in the yard a while before you go in?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "How long?" And I said, "Sometimes 20 minutes." She kept peeling. She did not look up at me, not once. And she said, "I do a half hour some nights. I tell him I am checking on the chickens." That was it. That was the entire conversation. Neither of us said another word about it. We finished the peaches and we washed the jars, and we talked about her sister's baby and the price of feed. 2 women in a hot kitchen, admitting to each other in code that we were both standing in the dark, delaying going into our own houses, and neither one of us able to say a single direct word about why. That is what the silence does. Rebecca and I loved each other. We had known each other since we were children. We were in that kitchen for 4 hours with nobody else in the house. And we could not tell each other the truth in plain language because plain language did not exist for this. It had never been given to either one of us. And I have thought about this a great deal since I left. Because here is the thing I did not understand for a long time. That silence is not an accident. It is not a gap. It is not something the community simply forgot to fill in over 300 years. It is load-bearing. A system that requires total submission cannot survive women having words. Words are how you compare. Words are how two women in a kitchen discover that their experience is the same experience, and that if it is the same for both of them, it is probably the same for all of them. And if it is the same for all of them, then it is not a failing in any one woman. It is the rule. And once you can see the rule, you can question the rule. And once you can question the rule, the whole structure begins to shift under your feet. So they did not forbid us from objecting. That would have been far too obvious. Somebody might have noticed. They simply never gave us the language in which an objection could be formed. And then they turned around and called the resulting silence a virtue, and praised us for it from the bench. And we sat there in our capes and our aprons, and felt proud of ourselves for having it. I want to say something about my husband now, because this is the part that matters most, and it is the part that I see people get wrong in the comments every single time. He was not a cruel man. He got up at 4. He worked until dark, and then he worked in the barn by lamplight. He built the bed we slept in with his own hands, and he sanded the posts smooth so they would not catch on my nightclothes. When I had a fever after the first winter, he did my milking and his own, and brought me broth and sat on the edge of the bed and did not know what to say, and stayed anyway. When our first child was born, he went out to the barn and cried, and one of his brothers told me that years later, and I had never once seen him cry in front of me. And he had been given exactly as little as I had. He was raised on the same sermons, on the same benches, by the same people. He was told his entire life that a wife yields and a husband leads, and that was the sum total of the instruction he received on how to be married to another living human being. He had a word for lead. He had a word for provide. He had a word for head of the household. He did not have a word for ask. Nobody ever gave him one either. The silence did not only fail the women, it failed every single person inside it. It just fell heavier on us. The way it always does. The way it always has. I left when I was 26. The cost came immediately, the way it always does. Shunning, Meidung. Letters sent back to me unopened with my own handwriting on the front of the envelope. My mother's voice on a payphone one time saying she was not permitted to speak with me, and then the click, and then the dial tone, and me standing there in a gas station parking lot holding a receiver in the cold. And a few years after that, sitting in a small office with a box of tissues on the low table between us, a woman with kind eyes and a notepad said a word to me that I had never once heard spoken aloud in 26 years of living. Consent. I asked her what it meant. I actually asked her. I was a grown woman with children of my own, and I sat in a chair and asked a stranger to define a word that everyone else in that building already knew. And she told me. Gently, carefully. And I sat there, and I did not cry, not right away. What I felt first was something much stranger and much colder than crying. I felt robbed, not of a night, not of one buggy ride on a frozen road in November, of a word, of an entire word that existed, that other people had, that people had been using casually in ordinary conversation my whole life on the other side of a fence I could not see over, and it had been kept from me the way you keep a knife from a child. Deliberately. For my own good, they would have said. For my protection. My therapist said something to me that afternoon that I have thought about every single day since. She said, "A cage does not need a lock if the bird was never given a word for sky." I have never gotten that out of my head. I do not think I want to. The plain world gave me things I will carry until the day I die. A work ethic that has never failed me once, not in the hardest years, not when I had nothing. A community that showed up. For every barn raising, every funeral, every long sickness. Without ever being asked, without ever expecting thanks, without a single word being spoken about it. Bread I still make from memory with my hands and no measuring cup. Faith. Complicated, wounded, torn down and rebuilt. But mine, and real, and still standing. And also this. Also a rule that no one ever wrote down, enforced by a silence that no one would break, that told a 20-year-old girl in a stopped buggy on a cold road between two fields that her own wanting was not a category that existed in the world. Both of those things are true at the same time. They have always been true at the same time. I am simply done pretending that only one of them is. If you grew up in a world where you were told that your obedience was love, I see you. If you were handed 100 rules for everything you owed, and not one single rule for what you were allowed to keep for yourself, I see you. If you have ever stood in a yard in the dark, delaying, inventing a reason, telling yourself it was the chickens, I see you. And I want you to hear this because nobody ever said it to me, and I have decided that ends with my voice. In this room, right now, you were allowed to say no. You were always allowed. They just never gave you the word. I was not too young to be a wife. I was too young to have a word for myself. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.